Hello, my name is Dave Emory, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 690. Update on the Meltdown, Part 5, Who and What was Roland Arnall? This program is being recorded on September 20th of the year 2009. This broadcast will highlight why I'm always telling people to use the website. I've now got everything I've ever done up on the SpitfireList.com website. There's tons of supplemental information. Of paramount importance is the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. If you haven't read that book, which is available for download for free on that website, you're really not going to understand these programs past a point. This is not meant to be self-righteous or confrontatory. It's simply a matter of fact. And beyond that, you're going to have a very difficult time grasping what is happening to you. And this program, I think, will underscore in very dramatic fashion why I'm always referring people to the SpitfireList.com website, why I'm talking about the book Martin Bormann and Nazi in Exile, and why a failure to read that book, which you can do for free, people, download it for free off of the website, but if you fail to do that, you're really not going to be able to grasp this past a point. For the Record 305, the description for that has a distillate of the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, but failure to come to terms with that book will not only greatly inhibit your understanding of these programs, but even more importantly, it's going to greatly inhibit your understanding of what's going on around us. And to make a very, very long story very, very short, yours and your ice cream and America's ice cream has turned to horse manure. And we're going to be talking about why as we join the many people from President Obama on down who have taken the roughly 1-year anniversary of the Wall Street and global financial meltdown to reflect on what has taken place and what can be done in the future. Now, there are a lot of contributing things to the financial meltdown, but of course one of the main ones was the subprime crisis. A great deal of America's and global financial infrastructure had come to be dependent on the various derivative elements of the subprime lending business. And when that went south, and it sure as bloody hell went south, everything else went south along with it. And what we're going to be looking at is who was at the epicenter and what was at the epicenter of the subprime business. How many of you have heard the name Roland Arnall, A-R-N-A-L-L. They've talked about Lehman Brothers. They talked about AIG. They've talked about Bear Stearns. We've heard about Madoff, and we're going to be talking about Lee Harvey Madoff, time permitting, later in the program. But most people really haven't heard a whole lot of Roland Arnall. His organizations, AmeriQuest and Argent, were the main vehicles for launching the subprime business. And the available evidence points strongly. It's by no means overwhelming, or no means definitive, I should say, but the overwhelming evidence, the overwhelming weight of the evidence for a knowledgeable individual points very strongly to Roland Arnall as a Bormann Jew, as one of the Jewish front people, or one of the at least nominally Jewish front people involved with the Bormann Flight Capital Network. Now again, for the description for the Record 305, has some of the key excerpts from the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. The book itself is available for download for free on the Spitfire website along with an introduction, so please use that. One of the most significant elements of the Bormann Capital Network, the economic component and political component of a Third Reich gone underground and perpetuated in mafia-like style, wielding consummate influence around the world by virtue of the tremendous economic power, which in turn has yielded tremendous political power for that organization. In turn, that, like the Japanese capital networks that we've been exploring the last couple of weeks in our work with the book Gold Warriors and its authors Peggy and Sterling Seagraves, are outgrowths of the international cartel system. Go to the SpitfireList.com website, go to the page marked Books, and there's a nice description and overview of the cartel system and how the forces that precipitated World War II grew out of that. But what we're going to be looking at in this broadcast, again, update on the meltdown part 5, who and what was Roland Arnall. We're going to be taking a look at what was at the epicenter of the subprime crisis. And it was the subprime business that was at the epicenter of the American and global financial collapse, which swept Wall Street before it and drove a great many individuals before it, and which has led to the tremendously dire economic conditions around the world, and maybe one of the reasons why you've lost your house, lost your job, and why, believe me, folks, it's going to get a whole lot worse. A lot of people ask me, what does the future hold? Where's it all going? I could sum it up pretty darn nicely with the vulgar popular expression, eat S blank 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 and die. You're probably familiar with that. Well, that's basically what the future holds. That's what you're going to do. You're going to eat S blank 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 and die in that order. And that's what's going to happen to your kids. That's what's going to happen to your spouse. It's going to happen to everything and everybody you like and love, unless the things that I'm talking about in these programs are dealt with. And if you don't deal with them, believe me, folks, they are going to deal with you. And, in fact, they have been dealing with you. Are you having fun in the economic downturn? Did you like the global financial meltdown? Did you like what happened on Wall Street last year? Are you having a good time? You like the jobless recovery? It's sort of oxymoron. It's like living death. You can't have a jobless recovery. Well, there are reasons for that. And we're going to be taking a look at one of the central elements of that in this broadcast. And again, for sort of popular exercise purposes, how many of you have ever heard the name Roland Arnall? The single most important name in the subprime business. Countrywide and Angelo Mazzillo basically got their chops from Ameriquest and Argent and Roland Arnall. But you haven't heard much about him, have you? Well, there's a reason for that. Now, before we go into Roland Arnall, the subprime business, Argent, Ameriquest, and the links with the Bush administration, the apparent links for a knowledgeable person with the Borman Network, we are going to take a look at Borman Jews. Now, the excerpts that I'm about to read come from the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, authored by Paul Manning, one of Edward R. Murrow's boys in World War II. He broadcast the surrender of Japan and Germany on the CBS radio network, served as a gunner on board aircraft to cover the bombing raids over Europe and Japan, was credited with killing at least one kill of a German Me-109, and then with the encouragement of Edward R. Murrow, and for a time with the financial underwriting of CBS News, which wouldn't go with the story, Paul Manning began his lifelong quest following the Borman Capital Network. And one of the key elements of the Borman Network, or one of the things to understand, is that it stresses what Manning calls the select participation of Jewish business people in its operations. This is done for several reasons. For one thing, what better way to mask a Nazi money laundering operation than to use Jews? Not only that, because as we're about to see, some of these Jewish business people and financiers also contribute their financial support to Israel, as does the Federal Republic of Germany, which is dependent on the Borman Capital Network, so that it buys the silence of the world's largest Jewish community and only Jewish state with regard to the post-war operations of the Underground Reich, because the Underground Reich is present in, among other places, in Israel and in the Jewish community. This should not be misunderstood as saying, oh, the Jews are fascists or Nazis. Many of the contemporary fascist elements are trying to make fascism out to be a Jewish phenomenon, which is testimony, I think, to not only their resilience and creativity, but also to the brain-dead but F blank 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 stupidity of an awful lot of the people around who can take something like that seriously. There has always been a fascist element within the Zionist movement. This is related but distinct. These are Borman Jews, and they wield a lot of influence in Israel. And given their influence, for example, with the Muslim Brotherhood, given the Borman's organization's consummate influence with the Muslim Brotherhood, it places them on both sides of the Arab-Israeli struggle, which is really a great way to wield decisive influence. But turning to Paul Manning and his book, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, of Borman Jews, my term, his concept, we read, Since the founding of Israel, the Federal Republic of Germany has paid out, by the way, before reading this, I should stress that this book was published in 1981, so the research goes back to the 70s and before, but it's accurate up to this time. But the book was published in 1981. The full story of that in About Paul Manning. The story of the frustration of the publishing of this book is in For the Record 604, Kicking Over the Traces. And again, in Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, published in 1981, Paul Manning writes as follows about Bormann Jews. That's my term. It's his concept. Since the founding of Israel, the Federal Republic of Germany has paid out 85.3 billion marks by the end of 1977 to survivors of the Holocaust. East Germany ignores any such liability. From South America, where payment must be made with subtlety, the Bormann Organization has made a substantial contribution to Israel as well. It has drawn many of the brightest Jewish businessmen into a participatory role in the development of many of its corporations, and many of these Jews share their prosperity most generously with Israel. If their proposals are sound, they are even provided with a specially dispensed venture capital fund. I spoke with one Jewish businessman in Hartford, Connecticut. He had arrived there quite unknown several years before our conversation, but with Bormann money as his leverage. Today, he is more than a millionaire, a quiet leader in the community with a certain share of his profits earmarked, as always, for his venture capital benefactors. This has taken place in many other instances across America and demonstrates how Bormann's people operate in the contemporary commercial world, in contrast to the fanciful nonsense with which Nazis are described in so much, quote, literature, unquote. So much emphasis is placed on select Jewish participation in Bormann companies that when Adolf Eichmann was seized and taken to Tel Aviv to stand trial, it produced a shockwave in the Jewish and German communities of Buenos Aires. Jewish leaders informed the Israeli authorities in no uncertain terms that this must never happen again because a repetition would permanently rupture relations with the Germans of Latin America as well as with the Bormann Organization and cut off the flow of Jewish money to Israel. It never happened again, and the pursuit of Bormann himself quieted down at the request of these Jewish leaders. He is residing in an Argentine safe haven protected by the most efficient German infrastructure in history, as well as by all those whose prosperity depends upon his well-being. Personal invitation is the only way to reach him. And then the program goes on to not only highlight the influence of the Bormann Organization in Israel, but it highlights what happened to Meyer Lansky when he tried to shake down the Bormann Group, in effect, in exchange for, quote, a piece of their action, unquote. Paul Manning goes on to write, a revealing insight into this international financial and industrial network was given me by a member of the Bormann Organization residing in West Germany. Meyer Lansky, he said, the financial advisor to the Las Vegas-Miami underworld, sent a message to Bormann through my West German SS contact. Lansky promised that if he received a piece of Bormann's action, he would keep the Israeli agents off Bormann's back. Quote, I have a very good relation with the Israeli secret police, was his claim, although he was to be kicked out of Israel when his presence became too noted, and also at the urging of Bormann's security chief in South America. At the time, Lansky was in the penthouse suite of Jerusalem's King David Hotel, in which he owned stock. He had fled to Israel to evade a U.S. federal warrant for his arrest. He sent his message to Bormann through his bagman in Switzerland, John Pullman, also wanted in the United States on a federal warrant. Lansky told Pullman to make this offer, quote, which he can't refuse, unquote. The offer was forwarded to Buenos Aires and the Bormann Group, where it was greeted with laughter. When the laughter died down, however, it was replaced with action. Meyer Lansky was evicted from Israel and was told by Swiss authorities to stay out of their country as well, so he flew to South America. In Latin America, he offered any president who would give him asylum a cool $1 million in cash, and he was turned down everywhere and had to continue his flight to Miami, where U.S. Marshals, alerted, were waiting to take him into custody. So again, that'll give you a brief overview of Bormann Jews, so to speak. And again, what a better cover for a Nazi money laundering operation than using Jews. It also gives them influence. Plus, when we start to see some of these institutions figuring in the meltdown, then people can point their finger and go, you see, it was the Jews. Hitler was right. You see, the Jews run the international economy. They are responsible for the Wall Street meltdown. Hitler was right, you see. And there are a lot of people starting to say that kind of thing right about now. Now, one of the things to note, in addition to, obviously, Bormann Jews, my term, again, Paul Manning's concept, but note that the Bormann organization employs tremendous secrecy about its operatives. We're going to talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger a little later, because Schwarzenegger, like many California politicos, was very close to the late Roland Arnall, but Arnold Schwarzenegger's sort of primary financial angel, so to speak, is a guy named William Armstead Robinson, a very secretive guy who appears to be a cat's paw for Deutsche Post and the DHS, or DHL rather, courier service. And that basically is enabling the German post office, controlled by the German government, to move into the the U.S. parcel delivery business. There is some complicated maneuvering going around with that, but in one of the many programs I've done about Arnold Schwarzenegger, part of the Triumph of the Shill series, I go into William Armistead Robinson, the main financial angel behind Arnold Schwarzenegger. The available evidence points strongly to Schwarzenegger as an underground Reich operative. But one of the things that characterizes Bormann operatives is extreme secrecy. They like to stay out of the news. They don't give interviews. It's a good way to stay below the radar, which is exactly what Roland Arnall wanted to do. Now, bearing in mind the concept of Bormann Jews, which we've just explored with some excerpts from the Manning text, also, one thing I want to mention in this context is something that John Loftus had in an article on his website. He is developing a new website, and I did not see this on the new website. We are going to talk about this with John Loftus the next time he visits with us, but the main reason, according to John Loftus, that the German government dragged its feet so dutifully in releasing documents about the Third Reich. There was a large documentation center in Berlin controlled by the German government. It was the single largest repository of information about the Third Reich. They only released it to journalists and historians a couple of years ago, more than 60 years after the end of World War II. And the main reason for that, according to John Loftus, is that as the Third Reich operatives were preparing for their post-war underground careers, a massive forging program was underway within the concentration camps using forgers, who were basically a captive workforce, to create very elaborate paper trails documenting many of these post-war Third Reich operatives as Jews. So that in addition to Bormann Jews per se, there is also a substantive body of underground Reich/Bormann Capital Network operatives who are basically nominally Jews, but are in fact good, loyal Nazis who have been given Jewish documentation. Again, what a perfect cover for an underground operative of any kind than to make oneself out to be the opposite of what one really is. So in addition to the concept of Bormann Jews per se, bear in mind that there was, according to John Loftus, a massive program to create a Jewish cover for post-war operatives. And then, rather like the financial crisis, it can be blamed on, negative things can be blamed on, quote, the Jews, unquote. But again, bear in mind the tremendous secrecy surrounding Bormann operatives. They go out of their way to stay out of the journalistic spotlight. For much of the broadcast, we're going to be taking a look at the book Chain of Blame, co-authored by Paul Muolo and Matthew Padilla. Paul Muolo, along with Mary Fricker and another author whose name escapes me right off the top of my head, was the author of Inside Job, about the savings and loan meltdown. And this book, Chain of Blame, was published by Wiley Books, copyrighted 2008 by Paul Muolo and Matthew Padilla. Now, of Roland Arnall and his position in the subprime crisis, the authors write as follows. Mazzillo here is Angelo Mazzillo, the top dog, so to speak, behind Countrywide, which, although it initially resisted subprime, eventually got involved with subprime. That helped to bring it down. And Countrywide was one of the funky assets picked up by Bank of America, which helped to put a lot of red ink on B of A's books. And, of course, one of the bottom lines with all of the institutions that were compromised by the subprime crisis, including many Borman banks like UBS and the Citicorp and others, one of the things to remember is that after all of these shenanigans took place, and bearing in mind what we looked at in the book Darkness in the Vaults, or in the show Darkness in the Vaults, using the book Gold Warriors, and in our recent interview with Peggy Seagraves and Sterling Seagraves, that banks like Citicorp and UBS had billions upon billions of World War II gold, looted gold, in their vaults, and it was just moved offshore. We're bailing out these institutions, folks, that have been compromised by the subprime crisis. The financial collapse did deep damage to America's financial future. It did deep damage to the American economy. It was a tremendous blow to America. Others suffered. America suffered worst. And it was the subprime crisis that was the prime generative force. And who was at the epicenter of the subprime crisis? A name you've probably never heard. Roland Arnall, A-R-N-A-L-L. Turning now to Chain of Blame by Paul Muolo and Matthew Padilla. And speaking of Angelo Mazzillo, the other reason Mazzillo took an interest in Arnall was that Arnall's current lending venture, AmeriQuest Mortgage, a retail non-depository based in nearby Orange, was beginning to accumulate a huge market share in subprime mortgages, a product niche that Countrywide had avoided for most of its 30-plus year history, but was now slowly but surely gaining traction in. Arnall was also on the verge of launching a nationwide wholesale lender called Argent Mortgage that was gearing up to sell subprime loans through loan brokers in as many states as possible and as quickly as possible. If there was one thing that Mazzillo paid careful attention to, it was market share. It was a given that he was going to let Arnall have some of his time. It also didn't hurt that Arnall was politically well connected, donating hundreds of thousands of dollars to federal and local politicians over the years. Former California Governor Gray Davis officiated at his wedding in 2000. As we're going to see, not only Democratic politicians, but even more importantly, Republican politicians, including Governor Schwarzenegger of California, deeply connected to Roland Arnall. And just as the subprime business was starting to turn funky, and just as the first cracks were beginning to appear in the edifice of the housing boom, the housing bubble in the middle part of this decade, and also not incidentally just as renewed journalistic scrutiny was being turned on the Netherlands and the Dutch connection to the Bush family's links to the Third Reich financial structure and to the Underground Reich, links like Bank for Handel and Scheepvaart, links like the Holland America Trading Corporation, links being explored by journalists like John Loftus and also John Buchanan. Just as that renewed scrutiny was beginning to be cast again on the Bush Nazi links in places like the Netherlands and elsewhere, Roland Arnall was appointed by George W. Bush to be the U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. But more about that later. Now, about Roland Arnall, and there really isn't a lot of information about Roland Arnall, but note again that not only the concept of Borman Jews, but the secrecy of Borman operatives, and also what John Loftus was talking about, the massive program underway near the end of World War II to create a Jewish documentation cover for post-war operatives. Of Roland Arnall, the Johnny Appleseed of subprime, as he was called later in this book, only one thing seems certain about his early years, that he was born in 1939 in Europe. His family was Jewish, which meant their lives were in danger as Hitler came to power and Nazi Germany expanded its borders by invading other nations. His official bio has him born in Paris on the eve of World War II. An unconfirmed press report says it was Poland. Arnall has never given any type of extensive interview about his past or about anything else for that matter. To avoid detection by the Nazis, the family said they were Catholic, according to one attorney who did business with Arnall. And still more. Again, that's about as much as is actually known, and that is, folks, precious, bloody little. Still more about this extremely enigmatic individual. Until the early 2000s, he was, for the most part, invisible, keeping his picture out of the papers as best he could. On occasion, there might be a story about the Los Angeles-based Simon Wiesenthal Center, which Arnall helped found, but not much else. His avoidance of the press was intentional. Arnall, to this dispute of no one, shunned publicity with an almost religious zeal. Cole, an LBM employee for just under 2 years, remembers a conversation he had with Arnall when he said, quote, "We've got to stay under the radar," unquote. Added Cole, quote, "He was very secretive. He shunned publicity. Roland does not give press interviews," unquote. Brief note, too, about the Simon Wiesenthal Center. The Simon Wiesenthal Center has remained dutifully silent about most of the things I talk about. They don't talk about the Galen organization. They sure as bloody hell don't talk about the Borman Group. In the past, I've suggested that there may be operatives, maybe people associated with the Simon Wiesenthal Center who are beholden to the Borman Group, perhaps because of some of the reasons we've already examined. But one of the things that's characteristic about a lot of the Borman corporations is they also, in addition to contributing to the support of Israel, they will contribute to the Holocaust Museum or the Simon Wiesenthal Center. It's not to say that the Wiesenthal Center hasn't done some good work in the limited context in which it operates. It has. But again, another great cover for Borman companies is to contribute to Holocaust remembrance or to the Wiesenthal Center or something else. Certainly, what a great cover for a spy. But again, this is Mr. Subprime. This is the guy who is behind Subprime more than anyone else. Of the role of Roland Arnall, Ameriquest, and Argent in Subprime, we read as follows. Even though Arnall was out of the business by 2007, he, as well as the Jedinaks, had left behind a family tree of executives and loan officers who had worked at one of his companies and then decided to either start their own subprime shop or work for an existing one, taking along with them the tricks of the trade, not all of those good. In a way, Arnall had served as the Johnny Appleseed of the subprime industry. Jack Mayish, Arnall's right-hand man at Long Beach Mortgage, stayed out of the business for 3 years after the company was sold to Washington Mutual, and then reemerged with a brand-new lender called Residential Mortgage Assistance Enterprise, or ResMe for short. Note how it sounds like Fannie Mae. It was based in Brea, nestled in the foothills of North Orange County, 20 miles from the Pacific Ocean. Its specialty, to no one's surprise, was subprime lending. Mayesh's backers on Wall Street, Lehman Brothers, and UBS's Greenwich Capital, which promised to lend him money and either buy or securitize his loans. Joining Mayesh in his new venture were 2 other former executives who had worked for Arnall, Edward Resendez and William Comperda, Komperda. In its first year of operation, ResMe funded $1 billion in loans, a phenomenal sum for a company that a year earlier didn't even exist. And we're going to pick up where we left off right here at the end of Side 1 and Side 2. We're going to take a look at the Johnny Appleseed of subprime, because it was the subprime crisis, the subprime phenomenon, that brought down the global financial structure and which has done incomparable and, frankly, past a point, irreparable damage to the United States. This country is in debt up to its eyeballs and is going to stay that way for a long, long time. And by the way, folks, guess who picks up the tab for the interest we're talking about here? You. John and Jane Q. Public. So if you like it, rock and roll, folks. Enjoy. This concludes Side 1 of For the Record program number 690. Update on the Meltdown, Part 5. Who and what was Roland Arnall? This is being recorded on September 20th of the year 2009. My name's Dave Emory. Thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 690. Update on the Meltdown, Part 5. Who and what was Roland Arnall? This program is being recorded on September 20th of the year 2009. We're going to plunge right back in. If you missed the discussion in Side 1, well, go back and get it because it's essential. We're taking a look at Roland Arnall, whom I believe to be what I call a Bormann Jew, one of the Jewish operatives of the post-war Nazi Bormann capital network, the dominant economic force in the world, along with the Japanese underground economic empire. We've been taking a look at Roland Arnall. Now, it was Roland Arnall and his AmeriQuest and Argent companies that were basically at the epicenter of the subprime operations, and it was the subprime crisis that basically brought the whole thing down a year ago. Now, how much is known about Roland Arnall? Again, this is the guy who more than any other individual was responsible for it. What I really think is that it was the people behind him, because look what came out of the subprime crisis. It completely beggared the United States. It beggared individuals. It beggared financial institutions. It did a tremendous amount of harm to the United States and many of its institutions. It has indebted America for a long, long time to come. We also wind up making a lot of payments to a lot of the companies that benefited from this. The bottom line, folks, the bottom line is you. You are the ones, the taxpayers, who picked up the tab. But this is the guy who more than any other individual was responsible, Roland Arnall. Ever heard about him? I'm going to reiterate, this is all that is known about him for sure, from the book Chain of Blame by Paul Moolo and Matthew Padilla, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name. Only one thing seems certain about Roland Arnall's early years, that he was born in 1939 in Europe. His family was Jewish, which meant their lives were in danger as Hitler came to power and Nazi Germany expanded its borders by invading other nations. His official bio has him born in Paris on the eve of World War II. An unconfirmed press report says that it was Poland. Arnall has never given any type of extensive interview about his past or about anything else, for that matter. To avoid detection by the Nazis, the family said they were Catholic, according to one attorney who did business with Arnall. That's all that's known about this guy, and that, folks, is what is known in professional circles as omitted information. Again, the secretiveness characteristic of Bormann operatives and the Bormann network, as we've looked at, uses Jews. There are also people who are actually Nazis using forged Jewish documentation. Now, about Roland Arnall, AmeriQuest, and Argent's central places in the subprime business, reviewing more information from Side 1 and developing further. Even though Arnall, again from the book Chain of Blame, even though Arnall was out of the business by 2007, he, as well as the Jednaks, had left behind a family tree of executives and loan officers who had worked at one of his companies and then decided to either start their own subprime shop or work for an existing one, taking along with them the tricks of the trade. Not all of those tricks, good tricks. In a way, Arnall had served as the Johnny Appleseed of the subprime industry. Jack Mayesh, Arnall's right-hand man at Long Beach Mortgage, stayed out of the business for 3 years after the company was sold to Washington Mutual, and then reemerged with a brand-new lender called Residential Mortgage Assistance Enterprise, or RESME for short. Note how it sounds like Fannie Mae. It was based in Brea, nestled in the foothills of North Orange County, 20 miles from the Pacific. Its specialty, to no one's surprise, was subprime lending. Mayesh's backers on Wall Street, Lehman Brothers, and Greenwich Capital, by the way, Greenwich Capital of UBS, which promised to lend him money and either buy or securitize his loans. Joining Mayesh in his new venture were 2 other former executives who had worked for Arnall, Edward Resendez and William Comperda. In its first year of operation, RESME funded $1 billion in loans, a phenomenal sum for a company that a year earlier didn't even exist. Well connected, eh? Says Dave, parenthetically. Continuing, another former Arnall acolyte at Long Beach Mortgage was Stephen Holder, who went on to help start New Century Financial Corporation, a non-bank that eventually supplanted AmeriQuest Argent as the largest subprime funder in the United States. Holder eventually left New Century and formed yet another company, Encore Credit, which Bear Stearns backed. Also out of Long Beach came Frank Curry, who formed Acoustic Home Loans. LBM alumni Pat Rank and Bob Derbysh opened Option One Mortgage, which eventually was sold to Fleet Bank of Boston and then to H&R Block, the tax preparation giant. In time, option 1 became a top 5 ranked subprime originator. Arnall employee Tim Walsh launched the retail arm of First NLC Financial Services of Deerfield Beach, Florida. Eventually, more than 100 AmeriQuest employees, including several top sales managers and loan officers, would join him. So again, when we're talking about Roland, Arnall, AmeriQuest, and Argent, they are the epicenter of subprime, and subprime is the reason all this stuff went down. More about their huge PR and advertising campaign, and also about the various institutions which they backed, ranging everything from the Texas Rangers Stadium, the land sale for which helped to enrich George W. Bush, turning once again to Chain of Blame. This is about AmeriQuest, along with Argent, Roland Arnall's main operations. The idea was to brand the AmeriQuest name on anything that would give the company maximum exposure and make its telephones ring. As Cole had noted, it was all about selling. Over the years, AmeriQuest bought the naming rights to the Texas Rangers baseball stadium and advertised on the walls of major and minor league stadiums, on both major and minor league stadiums. It sponsored a tour by the Rolling Stones, and even topped that by hiring Sir Paul McCartney to play the halftime show at the Super Bowl, the AmeriQuest name emblazoned over the TV screen as the former Beatle finished "Live and Let Die." Argent, even though it didn't deal directly with the public but through loan brokers, sponsored NASCAR race drivers such as Dario Franchitti and Danica Patrick, the Argent name printed proudly on their cars and uniforms. It sponsored athletes far and wide: Jim Furyk, Chris DeMarco of golf, Michael Phelps, and Amanda Beard, the U.S. Olympic team, among others. Terry Rauch, who worked for several of Arnall's mortgage companies over the years, noted that AmeriQuest's and Argent's names were truly everywhere, unquote, saying the company's plan was to create instant name recognition, quote, not to just brokers and borrowers, but literally to the world, and with all 50 state attorney generals, unquote. The mention of the AGs by Rauch was a joke, but that's exactly what happened. AmeriQuest Argent was nothing short of a mortgage juggernaut. Not only was it the largest subprime lender in the nation, but it now ranked 10th among all residential leaders. The industry knew it, Mazzillo knew it, investment bankers knew it. Managing directors from Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and Friedman Billings Ramsey had all knocked on Arnall's door to try to convince him to take the company public through an initial public offering. Year after year he resisted, but then in late 2004 he began to think otherwise. Around this time, both the press and several attorney general's offices, California, Connecticut, Iowa, and New York among them, began paying attention to a growing pile of allegations against the company, that some of AmeriQuest's retail loan officers were a little bit too high pressure on the sales tactics, convincing homeowners to take out loans they couldn't afford. It was also around this time that Arnall's retail production chief, the man in charge of all the loan officers on the street, Kirk Langs, announced his retirement. Langs was just 40 years old. The company, true to form, said little about the retirement. Rumors began to circulate in the industry that Langs might have walked away with a retirement package worth $17 million. He, like Roland Arnall, his boss, wasn't one to give interviews. And still more now as things are starting to go south. And it's worth taking a look at the timeline here. And again, note that this is the guy basically who, at least nominally, and I think really from an analytic standpoint, one would have to say it was the forces for whom he fronted that basically produced what you saw last year and what is bedeviling all of us. But this is the guy, Roland Arnall. Ever heard of him? That little bit of non-bio, which is the best way of putting it, that's all that is known about the guy. That's plenty, bloody, damned little. More from Chain of Blame about how things began to go south for AmeriQuest and Argent and Arnall. And remember, though, the passage that we just read, it was Arnall, AmeriQuest, and Argent that were sort of the breeding grounds for those who basically carried the whole subprime situation forward. They described him as the Johnny Appleseed of subprime. Returning again to Chain of Blame, rumors were swirling around about Arnall's AmeriQuest being the subject of predatory lending investigations in multiple states. The last thing in the world the market liked was an investigation about a mortgage firm's lending practices, even if it was an aberration. And it was doubly bad that the rumors concerned the nation's largest subprime lender, AmeriQuest. Now, as the cracks are beginning to appear in the edifice here, and also, as I've noted, it was in the early and middle part of this decade that the investigative spotlight, so to speak, was being turned on the Bush family Nazi connections, and a lot of those went through the Netherlands. And for the records, 361, 370, and 435, particularly in 370, we went into the Bank for Handel and Scheepvaart, which, along with the Thyssen Bank and the Union Banking Corporation, headed up by Prescott Bush Sr., were the main banks that the Thyssen operation had set up to avoid appropriation after World War I and then later after World War II. When the president of the Bank for Handel and Scheepvaart found out that his Netherlands bank was actually a front for Nazi money laundering, he went to New York to talk directly to its parent company, the Union Bank, and its president, Prescott Bush Sr. He died of an apparent heart attack under very strange circumstances a short time after that. That is to say, the president of the Bank for Handel and Scheepvaart, not Prescott Bush Sr. Again, for the record, 370 goes into those Dutch connections at great length. So do 361 and 435. And the declassified documents proving the Bush family's involvement with Nazi industry before, during, and after World War II can be examined, the actual documents, in a linked URL to the WestSpitfireList.com website. Now, as things were beginning to go south here for Arnall, as the first cracks were beginning to appear, and as journalists were starting to focus on the Bush family Nazi connections, some of those going to the Netherlands, Roland Arnall, that mysterious individual at the epicenter of the subprime and financial crisis, about whom nothing effectively is known for sure, was appointed by George W. Bush to be the U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands, where he would not only be out of the United States, but in a position to monitor anything that was going on vis-a-vis an investigation of the Bush family Nazi/Bormann links running in the direction of the Netherlands. Turning now, again, to Chain of Blame by Paul Muolo and Matthew Padilla. Wall Street firms had made well over $100 million in fees from AmeriQuest, Argent, and affiliated lenders over the years by lending them money and securitizing their subprime loans, but the biggest payday of them all, underwriting fees from an IPO, likely would never materialize. Word of several state attorney general investigations concerning its lending practices had killed that hope. In late July, this is 2005, in late July, the Bush White House made it official. Arnall was being considered for the ambassadorship to the Netherlands. This time, AmeriQuest spokesman Chris Orlando finally decided to say something, quote, "Mr. Arnall would be willing and honored to serve his country in any way he might be asked," unquote. Even though Arnall and his wife had made large donations to the Democratic National Committee over the years, all 8 Democrats on the Foreign Relations Committee, which had first vote on ambassadorships, said they would vote no because of the abusive lending allegations hanging over the company. Republicans were inclined to vote yes. Republican Senator Norm Coleman from Minnesota said of Arnall, quote, "His personal actions had never been called into question," unquote. In January 2006, after several more months of rumors about what the Attorney General's offices were up to, AmeriQuest made it official, agreeing to pay 49 states $325 million to settle charges that it engaged in abusive lending practices. Virginia was excluded from the settlement because AmeriQuest didn't lend there. It was the second largest home lending settlement in U.S. history. Roughly 750,000 loans that AmeriQuest had made to its boiler room-trained loan officers were affected by the settlement. On average, each AmeriQuest customer would get $600. One of the most damaging charges against the company was that its loan officers had engaged in a practice called upselling, where the loan officer was compensated extra money to originate mortgages at a higher note rate or more payments, or more points. In settling, the company admitted no wrongdoing and boasted to the press that the settlement with the states in no way restricted its ability to lend. The deal also cleared the way for Arnall's ambassadorship to go through, though the vote was narrow. Shortly thereafter, his wife Dawn was named chairman of ACC, the holding company that oversaw AmeriQuest and Argent. Argent, the wholesale arm that used brokers, wasn't part of the settlement, though Iowa Attorney General Tom Miller told reporters that the states would begin investigating wholesalers and brokers. And more about how this began to play out once things began going south, turning again to Chain of Blame by Paul Muolo and Matthew Padilla. Wall Street firm after firm would announce they were writing down by billions of dollars the value of subprime CDOs they held on their balance sheet. CDO, by the way, collateralized debt obligation. Well, beginning again, Wall Street firm after firm would announce that they were writing down by billions of dollars the value of subprime CDOs they held on their balance sheets. The numbers were getting huge. Citigroup, $11 billion with potential exposure on CDOs and structured investment vehicles of $45 billion. Union Bank of Switzerland, UBS, a major warehouse lender to subprime banks and an investor in CDOs, $10 billion in write-downs. Merrill Lynch, $8.4 billion. Bear Stearns, $1.2 billion. HSBC, the London bank that had bought subprime giant Household Finance earlier in the decade, was taking a $3.4 billion loss on subprime loans it held. These were markdowns on their value, not necessarily net losses. The reason they were being marked down? Subprime delinquencies. And then, as the crisis began to really develop, what happened to Roland Arnall? He came down with and died of a fast-acting, or apparently fast-acting case of cancer. Now, a couple of notes. The guy was 70. People do die of cancer, but as veteran listeners to this program know, first of all, cancer can be used as an assassination weapon. Freedom of Information Act documents that have been declassified have revealed that as early as 1954, the CIA had perfected a means of using cancer as an assassination weapon. In the years that the various simian cancer-causing viruses have been researched and almost certainly weaponized, those techniques have grown more sophisticated. So cancer can be used as an assassination weapon. There have even been a couple of murder convictions where people were convicted of murdering someone using cancer. Also, veteran listeners to this program know that when these various investigations begin to unfold and when they get sensitive, a lot of times some of the people who are most sensitive buy out. And just as the whole financial collapse was really beginning to gather steam or momentum, Roland Arnall dies of cancer, turning again to Chain of Blame. Adam Bass of AmeriQuest Capital Corporation, Arnall's holding company, now winding down what was left of its assets after the sale of Argent and AmeriQuest's servicing business to Citigroup, was in attendance. The only reporter there was Lou Sitchelman, the nationally syndicated housing columnist. Sitchelman dined with Bass during the conference. A few weeks later, Arnall died of cancer in Los Angeles after having resigned his ambassadorship to the Netherlands. He had come back to the United States from Europe to be with a seriously ill son who was also battling cancer. The intensely private man had never let on publicly that he, too, was sick. True to form, he had done his best to live under the radar. And more about the death, the very timely death of the very secretive Roland Arnall. Again, when the first cracks in the financial edifice were beginning to appear, and when journalists were taking a look at the Bush family Nazi connections, a lot of which go to the Netherlands, Roland Arnall is appointed by George Bush to be U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands, thereby out of the country and in a position to manage any investigations going in the direction of Bank for Handel and Schaeffart or any of those related companies. And then, when the whole thing is really coming down, Roland Arnall is no more. The highly secretive Roland Arnall dies of a very conveniently timed case of cancer. Of the death of Roland Arnall and his funeral, the authors Muolo and Padilla write as follows. In the world of subprime collateralized debt obligations, it was all about transferring risk from the mortgage lender into an ABS into a CDO. The fool was the last one holding the bond. Some of these fools were headquartered overseas in faraway lands. Others were foreign banks or investment banking firms that had set up shop in New York City to lend money to non-bank subprime lenders, securitize their mortgages, create tranches, package them into CDOs, and send them across the Atlantic. Some were unlucky enough not to find investors for their CDOs, which meant they held them in their own investment accounts. Germany's Deutsche Bank, parenthetically a Bormann Bank, Switzerland's UBS Securities, parenthetically a Bormann Bank, and Royal Bank of Scotland's Greenwich Capital was Royal Bank of Scotland, not UBS, were all major players in the U.S. subprime market. In April of 2008, UBS took a $19 billion write-down on its subprime business, which included securities that had fallen in value and were now worth a fraction of their original worth. 2 weeks before UBS unveiled its huge loss, AmeriQuest founder Roland Arnall died of cancer and was buried in Griffith Park in Los Angeles. Terry Rauch, who used to work for Arnall as an account executive, was in attendance, as were family, friends, and other employees, and politicians far and wide, including Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, former Governor Gray Davis, and current California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, the retired movie star. During the entire ceremony and procession, Schwarzenegger stood near Rauch, who with his sunglasses and athletic build blended in with the governor's security detail. Arnold put his hand on my shoulder a few times, remembered Rauch. He thought I was one of his bodyguards, unquote. Rauch didn't recall anything being said at the funeral about AmeriQuest. It was obvious to him that it was neither the time nor the place. The focus, as it should have been, was on Arnall's achievements as a humanitarian, his work with the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Quote, "It felt like a political rally where the amount of politicians coming to pay their respects," unquote, said Rauch. It was a touching Jewish ceremony. You could say there wasn't a dry eye in the place, but it wasn't necessarily for the passing of the father of subprime. It was for our own futures, unquote. Well, again, note the people in attendance, chiefly here Governor Schwarzenegger. Note that these banks, Deutsche Bank, UBS, they have been recipients of bailout money. And who, folks, is underwriting all of this in the end? You and I, the taxpayers, are the one who are picking up the tab, and it has done tremendous harm, not only to America's economic present, individual Americans, but to the individual and collective economic future of this country and its citizens. It has been a huge, huge blow, and the size of the damage has really been kept relatively quiet. Perhaps in another update on the meltdown, some of the real scary numbers involved here will be gone into. But bearing in mind Citicorp, which got a big bailout, and bearing in mind UBS, we talked about those in For the Record 688, and again in our conversation with Peggy and Sterling Seagraves. Those banks have billions and billions and billions of dollars in stolen World War II gold, some of the Golden Lily loot sitting in their vaults. It's Black Eagle Trust / Golden Lily loot, billions upon billions of dollars. And when we were talking about the heirs of Santa Romana trying to get their hands on that gold, it was described as $50 billion in Citicorp's vaults. That was decades ago, folks. That's a whole lot more than that right now. But doesn't matter. In the end, we wind up picking up the tabs. I'm going to talk briefly here about Lee Harvey Madoff, although it was not directly connected to the financial meltdown on Wall Street. At the same time, the collapse of what turned out to be a Ponzi scheme, the Madoff Fund, not only helped to further cast a big chill on the investment climate, but also a lot of people started, there was actually a fair amount of internet rap, so to speak, about, you see, it's the Jews responsible for the financial meltdown. It's one of the reasons why the Bormann Group uses Jews. One of the things to pay attention to vis-a-vis the Madoff operation, as I've called him in the past, Lee Harvey Madoff. No sooner did he get busted, he said, nope, I'm the only one. There's nobody else involved. And, well, since then, his chief financial officer, Frank DiPasquale from New Jersey, has been indicted. Very interesting. The story, really, with regard to the Madoff operation, are the feeder funds that channeled, basically, money into the Madoff operation. Also, where has the money gone? The vast bulk of this money has disappeared. Offshore, folks, into the dark vaults I spoke about a couple of programs ago in 688. Who knows where the money went? But the key element vis-a-vis the Madoff operations are the feeder funds. Now, in previous discussions of Lee Harvey Madoff, I've discussed Mr. de Viachet, who was investing, a member of the French elite, who was investing European money in the Madoff operation. He was found dead near the end of last year, an alleged suicide. He supposedly took a bunch of sleeping pills and then slashed his wrists with box cutters, although one of the cuts was on his biceps. Now, I've never committed suicide via sleeping pills and box cutters, but that's a hell of a miss, folks, and I suspect that it was not actually suicide. I suspect he was suicided. But the French elite is controlled by the Borman Capital Network, as is the European elite. One of the other major feeder funds was Fairfield Greenwich Group, headed up by a guy named Walter Knoll, And it was the Fairfield Greenwich Group of Walter Knoll, by the way, a good friend of John J. McCloy III, that was one of the major feeder funds. In a nutshell, we're going to go quickly. This is an article from Vanity Fair's issue of April of 2009, article by Vicky Ward, Greenwich Mean Time, about Knoll. And when one examines the Knoll operation, Fairfield Greenwich Group, the evidence suggests very strongly that this, too, was a Borman operation. For openers, Fairfield Greenwich Group was sometimes steered to its client by Monica Knowles, that's Walter Knoll's wife, by Monica Knowles' cousins. Half Swiss, half Brazilian, she was a member of the prominent Hagler family. Her cousin Jorge Paulo Lehmann is Brazil's richest financier and co-owns InBev, Budweiser's parent company. That, by the way, that company InBev is a major investor in beverages of all kinds, including alcoholic beverages. The Hagler family are very, very interesting. I'd like to put out a request to listeners to send me what they can find about the Hagler family. They are of Swiss extraction, allegedly, according to Internet postings, involved in the arms business. During World War II, they moved from Switzerland to Brazil. Very interesting. More about Fairfield Greenwich Group. Skipping down. As Fairfield Greenwich expanded, the most prominent of its salesmen came to be Knoll's own sons-in-law, whose European and South American backgrounds were invaluable to the firm. As things stand, Walter Knoll owns 17% of FGG's business, as does Tucker, who, like Knoll, semi-retired 2 years ago. Fairfield Greenwich Group's chief shareholder is Andres Piedrahita, who owns 22%. Piedrahita, 50, is a short, brash Colombian married to Knoll's eldest daughter, Karina, 45. The other Knoll sons-in-law have also reaped riches from FGG, and all but one of them worked for the firm as well. Yanko della Schiava, 44, an Italian married to Knoll's second daughter, Lucina, 44, sold FGG in northern Italy and southern Switzerland. Knoll's fourth daughter, Alex, 41, is often called the earthiest of the sisters and is married to Swiss-born Philip Tube, 43. Knoll put him to work selling Fairfield Greenwich mostly in Brazil, where the Tubes moved before returning to Greenwich with their children. The family's baby, as she is often called, Marissa, married a dashing New York hedge fund manager, Matt Brown, 39. Only the third Noel daughter, Ariana, 42, chose a husband who decided not to work for FGG. He, by the way, is an Italian, and they live in London. I'm going to put this in the description for the show, but again, a knowledgeable observer looking at the Fairfield Greenwich Group feeder fund and all of their connections to Europe, particularly the Latin parts of Europe and Switzerland and Latin America, would say, sounds like Borman Capital to me. But that wraps up For the Record program 690, Side 2. Update on the Meltdown Part 5. Who and what was Roland Arnall? This has been recorded on September 20th of 2009. My name is Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.